and getting really obsessed about what each ticket stands for and which journey that one stood for and when it started and how long it took and all that. But those are just details. You don't really need to know all that stuff to go and enjoy Hamburg and Berlin and Paris and all that. You need the actual guidebook. And that is the actual Bible. So that's the Karaite position. And again, there have been some amazing Karaite scholars over the centuries. There's still a few lying about. But they're drowned out by the media. The average Jew will never have heard of them, hardly. Just as they probably have never heard of the Samaritan perspective on things. But since this is a periodic table of all the world's religions, I put them in there, even though there are only a few thousand of them. It's thought there's probably about 30,000 people that follow the Karaite tradition at the current time, which is, not an insignificant number. Therefore, they're in there. And I think we should be having conversations about what is revelation. I would like to say to the Karaites, well, how do we know that the books of the Torah are genuine? Spinoza, I think, had some criticisms to make of that, because if you're going to tell me that the first 5 books of the Bible are all exactly as Moses wrote, well, how come, they're contradictory, and how come Moses himself is referred to in the third person as Moses did this and Moses did that, and even, it doesn't add up logically, was Spinoza's point. So, there are conversations to be had here about the nature of truth and revelation and history. But let's have those conversations instead of, blowing each other up, I would say. Okay, that's those two, the Phoenicians and the box 42. It's quite interesting when you go into it, isn't it? Was that sufficient?
Yes. Do the first lead to the other, naturally?
Yeah. Have you come across the Samaritans before? Have you heard the parable of the Good Samaritan and all that before?
Never the full story, but I heard the formula, if I can say.
You vaguely knew the concept, but...
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, you've heard the story now. It's a good one.
Yeah. Okay. As next one. What about blue one, 33. And let's see. And 30, Sumerian.
Oh, wow. Okay. Huh. There we are, that's interesting. Okay, so so I'll start with the oldest, which is number 30, box 30, the Sumerian tradition. I've listed there's probably about 2,000 people alive today that still follow this tradition in depth. But in the whole of history, probably about 10 million. The Sumerians were the first civilization that was literate on planet Earth, as far as we know, even slightly before the Egyptians. They were in the southern part of Iraq, and they had they invented urbanization. They had the first cities on the planet. And these cities were very sophisticated places. In about 3000 BC, or 3,500 BC, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flow down into the sea, they had learned how to control the floodwaters and to use that water for agriculture. So they were growing crops in the fields, and they tamed animals, so they had flocks of sheep and cows and goats, and had quite a sophisticated living going on. They invented writing, which they ascribed to their god, the god of learning, the scribal god, who taught the temple priests how to write. He was later called Nebo, and they wrote down their sacred literature and their poems and their stories of the gods, their theologies. The first time in human history that this was ever done. And I've sat, I've studied Sumerian literature. I mean, there's some brilliant scholars have been around for the last few hundred years trying to decipher all this stuff and to translate it into modern languages. Some of the poetry is some of the most beautiful in the world, the most ancient. The Epic of Gilgamesh is probably the most famous of these texts, which tells the story of this hero king called Gilgamesh, who is very successful and quite powerful, quite popular and stuff. But he's a bit arrogant when it comes to the gods, and particularly the goddess. I don't need the gods, I'm a big king, I'm a big chap, I can defeat all my neighbours, etc., etc. He was arrogant. And so the goddess sent him Enkidu, who was his rival, to take him on in a sort of a show of humility. They became good friends, and eventually Gilgamesh learns through bitter experience to be humble. I mean, it's a brilliant story. It'd make a great movie. I'm sure somebody must have done it as an opera or an epic on Netflix or something. At one point, he wants to achieve immortality. I mean, his arrogance rises up to, it's everybody's dream, I want to live forever, kind of be immortal. So he goes to ask the very wise man called Utnapishtim, who lives by the seashore, to teach him the secrets of immortality. And Utnapishtim tells him that, yes, there's a herb that grows under the sea. If he can swim down and hold his breath long enough and bring the sacred herb back of immortality, he will then become immortal. So Gilgamesh is up for a challenge and he dives down. He can hold his breath, that's not a problem, but he's attacked by a serpent on the way back and the herb falls from his hand. And that's why we're mortal. That he lost that chance, because then all of us would be immortal. We'd have had that sacred herb. So these stories were written down, and they were the teaching stories used by the Sumerian priests and priestesses. Women were very important. They were equal to the men. The priestesses, with their goddesses, were revered as much as the gods. And for several thousand years, that civilization stayed intact and handed down to the next generation these stories. The writing was in Sumerian letters, which were not an alphabet, and they were wedge shapes printed with a spatula of wood onto clay, and they were written on clay tablets. And archaeologists have discovered hundreds, probably thousands of these clay tablets, which then enabled them to decipher Sumerian and translate all these stories. Quite a lot of them in the British Museum in London, which is where I studied them. What's interesting about the Sumerians is that they invented quite a few of the stories that later get into the Bible from Biblos. So Noah's flood, the story of Noah's flood, was originally a Sumerian legend or tale told by generations of Sumerian priests to their students and children. And it was another teaching story about not being arrogant. Because people were arrogant, they were doing wicked stuff, robbery, stealing, violence, rape, war, and all the rest of it. So the god of the Sumerians decides to punish them by sending them a big flood and a storm. But only one guy stays true and faithful to the god of wisdom, Ea. And so Ea takes pity on him and teaches him how to build an ark, which then saves his family and his relatives and so on. Now, he's not called Noah in that story, he's got a different name. But we know that the Jewish people, when they were in exile in Babylon, they were picking up all these stories. And that's how they got into the Bible. It's actually, some of those stories in early Genesis are Sumerian stories. And when scholars discovered this in the 19th century, when after we translated the clay tablets in the British Museum, we realised that Noah's Ark story, that's actually a Sumerian story, and it had a huge impact on biblical studies as people realised the importance of Sumerian culture. And that's just one story. There are, the Garden of Eden and the Tree of Life story, the eating of the apple and the fall of man, that's all a Sumerian story as well. The whole Adam and Eve story, which is like really central to the whole story of Judaism and all the rest of it, seems to have been a Sumerian story. And various texts have come down. Scholars are still arguing over which bits are which, but it seems that in the Sumerian version, it ends happily. Man is meant to live in a garden at peace with the gods, with each other, tending nature, and it looks like the Sumerians didn't have this being thrown out of the garden and suffering forever and ever. It seems that they had a happier ending, and the snake was actually a wisdom deity that helps mankind in the Sumerian story. So I don't know that any scholars have done this yet, but I'd love to see someone that assembles all the Sumerian Garden of Eden type stories, puts them all in one book with notes and references and the whole works and facsimiles of the tablets they're on and all that stuff, and then contrasts them to the biblical stories and the books of Enoch, which should be in the Bible but aren't, which give the backstory of the fall of man. And all that should be published as one thing, so that scholars like me and all Jews, Christians and Muslims everywhere in the world that go with this story can go back to the Sumerian sources and say, oh, that's what it all means. Because the story in the Sumerian version is man and woman are meant to be together happily because the gods in heaven, gods and goddesses, live together happily. So we're supposed to mirror that happiness on earth. So actually we never got thrown out of the garden. We're still in the garden if we choose to open our eyes and see it as it is. That would be the Sumerian take on this. Okay, so that's really exciting. There's a lot, if people are interested in Sumerian studies, go look into it. There's some great. Samuel Kramer, I think, is the great scholar that has done that work. And there are Sumerian dictionaries and so on, some of which I put into my philosophical dictionary of philosophical terms. I've got Sumerian in there. But, and this is a big but, scholars still, linguists, have not understood where Sumerian language came from. They can't find, is it an Indo-European language, is it a Semitic language, is it a Turkic kind of language, was it related to Japanese or Mongolian? There's no consensus. It seems to be a one-off. Where did who were the Sumerians actually? There's still a whole discussion. Nobody really knows. One thing that's quite interesting is that the people that live in southern Iraq, marsh-dwelling Arabs they're called, they use boats made of reeds, which are almost the same as what the Sumerians used to use. So culturally, those marsh-dwelling Arabs of southern Iraq are like descendants of the Sumerians. But Arabic is not related to Sumerian, although there are quite a lot of Sumerian concepts and ideas that got into the Quran and the Arabic spiritual culture, because the Quran took so much from the Bible, including the whole Noah's flood story and the Garden of Eden story and all that, that you read the Quran, as I did in my commentary, and it's like reading Sumerian legends again, Sumerian stories. But Muhammad didn't know that. When he was channeling the Quran, he probably had never heard of the word Sumerian. He didn't know about it. But he had an intuitive respect for the ancients. He always says, the Quran always says, its constantly recurring theme is, I'm not the only prophet, I'm just one of a long, long line, and I'm just bringing the eternal message to mankind. And all the wisdom of all the ancients, I'm just updating it, you know. So had he known about the wisdom of the Sumerians, he would have loved it. And what's interesting is that in his own journeys, I'm pretty sure he went to a place called Hira, which was a town near southern Iraq, and Kufa, another great town. They became great centres of Islamic wisdom and knowledge and philosophy. So I think Sumerian ideas got into mystical Islam. Right, so that's what about orthodoxy? So the other one we're going to look at is Christian orthodoxy, number 33. That's enough about Sumerian for now. Okay, so the word orthodox is a Greek term that means going straight to the truth, right? It wasn't actually a Christian term at all, it was pre-Christian. It was used by Aristotle, who said that all true philosophers go straight to the truth. You know, you don't beat around the bush. You don't lie. I mean, that undoes the whole point of being a philosopher. If you're looking for ultimate truth, then you have to go straight to it. I mean, it's hard enough to find it as it is. But if you're going to start lying and cheating, then you're not in the philosophy club, you know. So all philosophers should be going straight to the truth. But you know, the term came into use because it was among the Greek-speaking Eastern Roman Empire that Christianity first started to spread. I personally am pretty convinced, and not me alone, but thousands of other scholars have gone into it in huge detail, that Jesus himself was probably trilingual. He spoke Greek. He probably read it as well, because it was the language of learned people in his day. It was everywhere. You know, you couldn't be a carpenter and not know some Greek. You couldn't be a philosopher and not know some Greek. Even the Bible had been translated into Greek. He had access to all this stuff, in my opinion. He also spoke Aramaic, which was the language of the villages where he grew up in Galilee, which was closely related to Phoenician and Hebrew, another dialectical form of West Semitic. And he also probably spoke Hebrew itself. You know, the temple scrolls were written in it. The official Bible was written in it. So he could do the proper Hebrew when he had to. He might have also had a bit of Latin, even, for his day-to-day talking to soldiers type discussions. Although most of that would have been in Greek. The Bible that we know was then produced in Greek. St. Paul's letters were written in Greek because he was a typical Hellenistic Jew who thought in Greek, as did a lot of these learned Jewish people at the time, including, I think, Jesus. Philo, who was another learned Jewish guy in Alexandria, is typical of this. So Greek became the language of the early church. And it's some amazing treasures, you know, for people that haven't read the New Testament. I strongly recommend it. It's not that difficult. Read a few Gospels. The book of Acts was written in Greek. Luke, who wrote it, was a Greek-speaking. If there's disputes, was he originally Jewish or was he pagan? Anyway, he was a doctor and a painter who became Christian and wrote his Gospel of Luke and the Acts about the early church. This was all Greek-speaking and Greek thinking. So as it spread, that became the language of the church, and and the disciples and the apostles were using those Gospels. They created it as a book form, and it became their sacred writings. That was translated then also into Latin quite early on. So we had a Latin Bible. And in Rome, they tended to prefer the Latin Bible because they all spoke Roman, which was Latin. So the church had these two wings, if you want, the Greek-speaking East and the Roman or Latin-speaking West. They had the same Bible, but one preferred it in Latin and one preferred it in Greek. Most learned Christians back in those days learned both languages. And that really remains true to now. You know, if you really want to be like a Christian scholar, you should learn both, and you should be able to read the Latin and the Greek Bible. But it's, you know, classics are sort of dying out in normal schools, so that's kind of rare unless you're going to be a classical scholar. Sadly, it should be our birthright, in my opinion. I have a mixed relationship with the idea of the Orthodox Church because there's bad news and good news here. The bad news is symbolised by what Putin's doing with the Russian Church, because the Russian Church claims to be Orthodox. The phrase they use is the Russian Orthodox Church. You know, and what happened was that when the Emperor Constantine decided that Christianity was, you know, a good thing, he stopped persecuting it because the Roman Empire hadn't really known what to do with Christianity. They didn't know what to do with Christ. They had him crucified. They didn't know what to do with all these crazy followers going around saying he's risen from the dead, we're coming to get you. They thought they were crazy. They tried persecuting them. They tried ignoring them, that didn't work. Then they tried persecuting them and killing them and chopping their heads off and torturing them. That seemed to just make more martyrs, make more of them come out the woodwork. So that didn't work. So Constantine thought of another idea. He said, what if we convert the empire to Christianity and let the Christians run the show? Will that work? Then there was a problem. Well, which kind of Christianity? Because the Christians were always fighting among themselves as to which was the true version of the Christ story. No, he was the Son of God. Ah, no, he was the only Son of God. Ah, no, he was one of the Trinity. He was the Son of the Father and the Holy Spirit with whom he is one. No, come on, he was just ascended as the Son of God at the moment of his baptism, when the Holy Dove descended on him, and then he became the Son of God. He was received, but actually he was the son of Mary and Joseph. Oh, no, that's blasphemy, you can't say that. No, he was the eternally not begotten, not made, eternal Son of God who predates the whole universe. He was there with God in the beginning before the Big Bang. You know, and so on and so on. They're all arguing, right? And Constantine, who called a couple of councils, he just listened in despair because he wanted to help these Christians. He was prepared to make them like the official religion of the empire, but they were all arguing about the whole thing. Oh man, so he said, okay, you know, we're going to shut them all into this big building, and all 300 bishops and all that, which he called together, you're just going to have to agree on something, a document you must agree on, and then we'll call that the official religion of the empire. And with much grumbling and hassle and arguments and fistfights even broke out, they finally came up with a creed which set out, you know, what they believed, the Orthodox thing. And it was the official narrative, which is Christ is the only Son of God. He's born of a virgin. He comes to earth to save mankind from our sins. He dies and is reborn and ascends back to God. He's now in heaven. And he will judge the whole world when he comes back into the sinners and the good ones. To be a good one, you have to join the church and be a good member of it, and that's the only way to salvation. Don't ask too many questions. Just do what the priests say. Don't ask to read any of the hidden secret books, just read the official books that the church says these are the orthodox official books. Don't read any of those secret books, and whatever you do, don't read any of the Jewish books or anything else. Stick with the orthodox teachings. And if you don't, and it got, as they got power, these Christians got power, I think it corrupted them because they became much more like against everyone else that didn't agree with them. And instead of them being persecuted by the pagans, after a few decades, now they were in charge of the empire. Constantine had gone. And by the way, he was baptized on his deathbed by an Arian bishop called Eusebius, who was an Arian, which was one of the heretical sects, not orthodox at all. So Constantine wasn't the fool, because Arius said, this thing about Christ being the only Son of God, to be honest, it's just a legend. He was just a bloke like us, but a really good one. I mean, that's logic, right, said Arius. And he was persecuted for that. And he was shipped off and he died, in prison. But Constantine thought, actually, this Arius guy's right. So he secretly had himself baptized into that branch of the church, but had created this monster called the Orthodox Church, which was really a political fudge. These people, I don't think, had the right or authority to say what is ultimate truth. I'm speaking as a philosopher here, I don't think you can dictate metaphysics by politically generated councils, where some guy's in charge with the weapons. That makes the whole thing a fear-based control project. And that's what we see with Putinism. Fast forward, right? So that idea of there's one way, the orthodox way, everyone else is an evil devil person, that became the narrative that the official empire thought, we'll run with that because that makes me as Tsar or Caesar or ruler, gives me absolute power as long as my bishop's there, saying I'm God's appointed ruler on the planet, right? It's a fantastic scam because then you can't touch me because I'm God's appointed ruler, and therefore if I say you should go to prison for the rest of your life, that's God's will. Isn't that right, Bishop? Yes, Emperor, that's right. And so this became a scam, right, in my opinion, speaking as a philosopher. And the Christians started persecuting the pagans. Within a few decades of getting power, these so-called Orthodox Christians, actually shut the philosophical schools down. So they would have come and raided the philosophy club here in Betet and carted me off to prison. They actually shut the Delphic games, which are about the arts and culture. They closed the oracles of the ancient world, like Delphi and Dodona. They shut the Library of Alexandria and seemed to have burned it out of mere spite, because they didn't want people to have too many books and learning, and, it's all pagan, burn it. I mean, it was a nightmare for proper intellectuals and proper philosophers, right? Because we'd been happily doing our thing and writing scrolls and studying ancient wisdom for millennia. One of the last great philosophers was a woman called Hypatia. And these Christians were saying, you can't be a woman and know anything. They're just, women were the cause of all the evil through Eve. It says it in the Bible. So women, know your place, get back in the kitchen, And these mad monks, actually, because Hypatia was a learned lady teaching philosophy, these mad monks set on her and tore her to pieces. And it's said that it's a horrible thing to have to say, but they scraped the flesh off her bones using scallop shells as to really desecrate the body of this beautiful intellectual woman who is thank God they don't do that anymore. But lurking within Orthodox Christianity is this venomous hatred of the other and the suspicion that the other is diabolic. The reason they destroyed Hypatia is they'd been taught that all pre-existing wisdom and knowledge was diabolical. Their philosophy taught that, say the Sumerians or whatever, they're devil worshippers. Even the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans and Celts and Druids, they're all devil worshippers. Because not till Christ had true wisdom come to earth. Now that to me is a very narrow point of view. And I think it's wrong. I think I can demonstrate and prove that it's wrong. But there are people still today that believe that. And unfortunately, that has become the narrative behind the Russian Orthodox Church. When I wrote to the Russian Orthodox Church hierarchy 5 years ago and I asked them to sign my interfaith peace treaty, which I did to all the religious leaders of the world, they're the only ones that sent me back a really rude letter. Others just didn't bother to reply, or they said, maybe I'll think about it, But these guys, the Russian Orthodox Church, wrote me back a rude letter saying, we're not signing that, because that means we accept other religions have a right to exist and have some aspect of the truth. No. Only we, the Russian Orthodox Church, have the complete, total truth from God. Everyone else is a heretic. So in their map of the world, they had abolished the pyramid table of the world's religious and philosophical traditions and only have one box left, which is box 33. All the others should be burned. I was shocked when I got that letter from them, But now looking back, I realised that was the first whiff I got of Putinism at its worst and most crass. And particularly the patriarch behind it, this guy Cyril, who's Putin's sort of theological yes man, the patriarch of Moscow, who says all this, right? So that's the problem with orthodoxy, is it nurtures within it this venomous hatred of the other. And Putin's gained that into a hatred of liberals, a hatred of gays, a hatred of anyone that's not Russian and not a straight heterosexual white person. And Putin and his ilk have generated a hatred of the other generally. All other Europeans, this is why he hates the European Union, because we stand for inclusivity. In France here we have freedom of religion, so you can be a Muslim, a Jew, a pagan, a Druid, a Buddhist. As long as you stick to the French rules, you're fine. You're protected. As long as you don't do evil stuff, you can think what you want, just don't do wicked stuff. In Russia it's not like that. In their mindset, it's you're not allowed to think stuff. So that's the bad news about orthodoxy, right? I could tell you about Navalny, who's being kept in a jail, in a prison cell, much smaller than this room, for just opposing this. And in France now, there's an art exhibition in Paris going on of a replica of the actual cell. There's a bed, there's a bucket in the floor, and that's it. And it's now an art exhibition in Paris, as people are looking and seeing what, this guy is having to do. And there are thousands of people like that, the opposition. Now that all comes from their view of orthodoxy, which is that that's okay because they're evil, because they're opposing the good Tsar, Putin, the ruler, the government, and his patriarch. They're opposing Christ, and if you oppose Christ, you go to prison. You get tortured to death. And the worst Christian of all time, possibly, was Ivan the Terrible, the Tsar of Russia, who invented this concept of Russian Orthodoxy. He became the Russian Tsar. And he used to torture his enemies to death. And sometimes personally, but otherwise he got other people to do it. And as they were dying, he would come up to them and whisper, "Are you repenting now? I'm going to just break your other toe. Are you repenting yet?" And if the guy said, "Yes, I repent, you are the Tsar, I'm sorry," then Ivan would say, "Fine, now you can go to heaven. Now you've repented. I've saved your soul for eternity." And if the guy said, "No, I hate you, you're an evil Tsar, you're a ruler of demons," then he'd torture you to death and your soul's going to hell now forever and ever. And he thought in his crazy mind that he had that